Welcome everyone to Male Fuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about 5 Days at Memorial, which is the new Apple TV Plus miniseries that just launched today at the time of recording, but yesterday by the time this goes out. The first 3 episodes went up. This came in fairly high on the Patreon pilot vote over at patreon.com/MaleFuzzTV. And I was only going to watch the first episode, but I ended up watching all 3 episodes that they put out. And that was basically just an in the moment decision, because when I finished the first episode, which was only about 37 minutes, not counting like the behind the scenes stuff at the end that they tagged on, I kind of felt like it wasn't enough to really give a proper opinion. So I thought I'll watch at least the next one, and I ended up saying I'll just watch all 3. Which at least tells you right away that it wasn't torture to get through, because I was willing to do it. So I mean, take that as the first compliment. But I'll start this spoiler free, and you know I use a bit of air quotes there because obviously it's based on real events. So you know like how much of it would be even be considered spoiler is kind of questionable anyway. But the premise of this, and it's based on a true story, like I say, and it's about a hospital during and after Hurricane Katrina. And I don't really know much about this true story. Obviously, I've heard of Katrina, but this specific part of that kind of tragedy, I had never really heard much about this Memorial Hospital stuff. And I'd seen the trailer for this. We talked about it on the TV news podcast, you know, a month or 2 ago, and it looked a little bit action heavy, the trailer, which was kind of a weird choice to us when we looked at it. But I saw kind of maybe the potential for what it was doing. The trailer clearly, you know, said what the moral topic of the show was going to be, is seemingly in the real events, some of the patients that were found dead, and the first episode starts with like the discovery of the bodies before it cuts back and we see the main timeline. Some of them were intentionally euthanized, and the moral choice of, do you end a patient's suffering in this situation where they're not going to be helped in time and they're just going to suffer and die, or you know, do you put them out of their misery, kind of thing. So obviously very emotional topic, very serious in many ways. Bizarrely, the first thing I'd compare this to, having watched a few episodes, and I'm not saying it's as good as this, because what I'm going to compare it to here was exceptional. But the first thing I could probably compare it to is Chernobyl, the HBO miniseries about the Chernobyl disaster. And I say that in the sense that, you know, it's dealing with the disaster, which is the first point of comparison, but in the way that it's kind of unfolding as you're watching these first 3 episodes, at least, you're kind of slowly seeing the different phases of the problems that cropped up, the choices being made to try and deal with them, and in some cases the frustration over certain characters who are representing real people, which is, you know, the especially rage-inducing part, that chose not to make it their problem, chose to sit out of it, or made choices, or it's not as rage-inducing as Chernobyl, which right from the get-go there was just like absurdly like just not even ignorant. I mean, they were ignorant, but like just delusional choices being made and delusional assumptions being made. There are stuff that is upsetting, the decisions that are made and the sort of attitudes that are had by certain people, how little help they seem to be getting from anyone at this hospital, being the prime thing. But so yeah, it reminded me of Chernobyl a little bit. I think in terms of genre, it's probably that's the other thing in this genre that I've seen in the last few years that I can kind of compare it to. You got Vera Farmiga playing sort of the closest thing we have to a lead character, and she is kind of prominent because she's going to be she's the main one that was involved in all of the investigation and stuff afterwards. And so she's this doctor. The episodes have this structure where they kind of start with like a sort of interview piece, you know, that happens later with one of the characters, and they keep asking about her, so it kind of makes it clear that she's the one that's going to be very important as things go on. But for the most part, though, once you're into the main timeline of the show, you're just, you know, episode 1 is day 1, episode 2 is day 2, episode 3 is day 3. and 4 and 5 will be days 4 and 5 presumably, which leaves 3 episodes after that for the investigation, the aftermath, whatever it's going to do with that. You know, this comes from John Ridley and Carlton Cuse. I'm familiar with both of them to an extent. Carlton Cuse I know from being the co-showrunner on Lost, and he's done other TV stuff since then. I think he was involved with Bates Motel actually, which maybe explains how Vera Farmiga ended up with this role. And then John Ridley's written and directed different stuff. He wrote 12 Years a Slave as the main thing that comes to mind for me, but they're, I think, I don't know if they're literally billed as co-showrunners, but it certainly feels that way because they're directing the episodes each and swapping directing duties. They're writing episodes. They feel like they took creative names on here, and it's based on a book. It's based on Sherry Fink's book, which was an investigative book, I believe. So yeah, that's all the preface stuff. And as for the quality, I mean, I will say this: for all the things I have seen on Apple TV, none of their stuff has ever felt cheap. This feels very high quality. There is, you know, CG and stuff when it's showing the hurricane, because, you know, the first day is when the hurricane's actually happening, and we see like buildings being torn apart and stuff like that as the flooding comes in, there's the heavy winds. It's very high quality. The production value, I mean, is very high quality. It never feels hokey or anything like that. One of the concerns I had when I saw the trailer is that it felt like they were showing a lot of like moments like that, and I was like, oh god, how action packed is this going to be? It feels like that's not really the focus of it, but it's done quite well in that it actually intercuts a mix of actual real shots from the time, and then other shots which are kind of trying to represent shots from the time but aren't really. And what I mean by that is the show is in 2.35 to 1, which is, you know, your movie widescreen with the black bars at the top and bottom on a widescreen TV. But sometimes it'll show 4:3 footage from news broadcasts or something like that, when it's doing like montages showing how bad things are in the city, and, you know, the hurricane, and the first episode specifically, the hurricane sort of coming in and building up and the reports on that. But it also shows, like, you know, various shots of the streets and things that were taken at the time. But there's also a lot of shots where it switches aspect ratio to 4:3 or to 16:9, but they look too good. So they're clearly new shots. They're clearly stuff that they have done now, but they still chose to change the aspect ratio. I don't know if that was because they wanted to try and make it feel like authentic in the way it was, you know, cutting through these bits and pieces to give it kind of a feel, so that you always knew when you were in kind of that montage of like, here's the surrounding area. That still make it feel like it's news footage even when it isn't. But it was kind of like odd the first time it happened, where I was like, wait a minute, that was not from the time, because that looked just as Dolby Vision as the rest of this. But it is effective in creating kind of the mood and the danger that's building up, and kind of this ticking clock feeling, because, you know, all these interview segments at the start of the episodes keep clearly indicating things are going to get dark. And they don't quite get dark in the first episode, or even the first 3 episodes by and large. Like, obviously they're in danger, they've got problems to solve, but clearly what made this story very questionable and dark is we're still building up to those choices. So yeah, it's very high quality. Production value is great. It's got a very solid cast throughout. I'm not even going to begin to pretend that I have remembered any character names, pretty much, because there's so many of them. It is bouncing around a lot of people. There's a lot of doctors, there's patients. That's one of the things, that knowing kind of the broad strokes of what this story is going to be just from the trailer, like the fact that it's letting me get to know a couple of the patients that are more ill, and even letting me get to know some of their family members, it clearly feels like it's setting me up for some heartache later on, and making some of these choices that are going to be made feel like they're going to be tough choices. Honestly, the biggest thing that I've probably enjoyed in it, out of these first three episodes, is, and it's what I always enjoy about these types of things, is the logistics, the realizations, and the problem solving. Which is to say, oh, this thing's going to happen, we have to come up with a plan. Okay, what can we do? And then what should we have access to that we don't because there's poor planning, or whatever. You know, one of our main characters, played by Cherry Jones, is like the crisis coordinator. That may not have been the exact phrase they use, but like, she's the one actually sort of like running the place through this crisis. And like obviously you have the hurricane itself, and the morning after everyone's quite optimistic. We made it through the night. There's a lot of damage and flooding, but it's not that big a deal. And then there's going to be more flooding, which is going to cause more problems, and it escalates from there. So, no, I think it's really solidly done, and it's engaging. It's kind of always interesting what's going on. Sometimes rage-inducing about like what they should be getting help from other places but aren't, or the realization moments for some characters when they realize that help isn't coming, or something like that. And some of the wider scope things that it does in episode 2 and 3 I kind of liked as well, in terms of like the corporate head, which is it's weird, obviously I live in a place that has national healthcare, has free healthcare, so it is weird to me inherently just to hear about the corporate head of the like who owns this hospital, and like some of the more businessy talk about it and how it affects their business and stuff. That feels just skeevy to me immediately. But then then certain characters are clearly quite bad and take it one step worse. So that was interesting as kind of an outsider to that system, I suppose. But just like seeing the frustration of certain characters who clearly realize that something needs to be done and it isn't being done. It does some interesting things with how rumors are spread, I would say. That's like something that happens in episode 2 that I won't go into, but kind of how like maybe some hysteria starts to happen just because information is being construed and it's changing and it's shifting a little bit person to person. And that I also thought was very interesting. It was kind of maybe my favorite thing about episode 2 was that little kind of exploration, and just sort of a good way to analyze like how things actually happen in these crises, where how did it build to these choices that are ultimately going to be made, what created certain things. Is it it's watching sort of how it might happen in a realistic sense versus, say, I don't know, how the hospital riots and Halloween kills. For some reason, it's the first thing that popped in my head, but that's just laughably silly in how that happens. But like, and obviously this is based on a true story, so inherently it should be more realistic because it actually happened. And obviously, like, I don't know how 100% accurate a lot of this is. I don't know. I really don't know what details are exactly correct, what stuff isn't. There was something in episode 3 that was kind of a nice little fist pump moment, and I don't know if that was just there for, the drama of a TV show, or if it was something that actually happened, in which case it's a nice thing to find out about if it did. But yeah, so I think I'll probably say spoilers and just talk about some of the things that happens in the 3 episodes. What I will say before I go on, though, is I don't think I'm going to review the rest of this show, and it's not because I don't think it's worth watching. I actually think I'll probably watch the rest of it. But I just don't know how much I'm actually going to have to say about each episode. I think I'm glad I watched the 3 episodes before I talked about it and gave an opinion, because I don't think episode 1 was enough to judge it on, because it's kind of the build up to the hurricanes kind of starting to get worse and worse. And it builds up to kind of one, potentially scary moment at the end that it has to be dealt with, but it didn't give me enough. Episode 2 would probably be enough, but I'm glad I watched the 3rd one as well, because it kind of opened the scope up a little bit more about some of the other things that the show's going to talk about. And I think it's wise that they put the 3 out together, especially since the first 2 are quite short. The first 2 are only about 37 minutes each, and then the 4th one's maybe like 44 or something like that. So they're not super long compared to your typical like sort of big production dramas. They're a little bit on the shorter side, which is good in a sense, because they're not dragging it out needlessly to hit some arbitrary runtime. This is how much story there is on day 1 of this, so that's how long the episode is. This is how much there's in day 2, day 3, so on, and just go with it. So yeah. But yeah, I'll give a spoiler warning just to talk about some of the other things that I liked in these 3 episodes. The episode 2 rumor thing I really liked is some of the security or whoever it is outside says to one of the nurses, maybe when she's coming back inside, that keep a watchful eye outside. We saw like some young people maybe staring at a nurse or something. It was kind of like just be alert just in case anything escalates. And it was a fairly light warning. It wasn't like anything had actually really happened. It was just, you know, be careful. It was just a nice, friendly kind of warning from a security guard. And then you see that person, you know, immediately cuts to her telling someone, and it turns into, you know, someone was being harassed by a group of young hooligans. And then that person who hears that tells the next person that a nurse got attacked by a group of young hooligans. And the person who heard attacked assumed that was a sexual attack, and then the next time it's that person saying a nurse got raped by hooligans outside. And then later on we even hear it said back to one of the main characters, and it's now turned into a couple of nurses, and it's, you know, it's escalated throughout the hospital. And it was kind of this that goes coincide with some of the patients and, like, you know, family members worried that they're going to be told to leave, and that's also spreading throughout the episode. So it was kind of like tackling this idea of how stories spread, even though no one actually has any information, that they're almost just making up information so that there's something to feel like they can do something about in a weird way. Because the waiting's, you know, arguably in some ways it's not the worst part, but it's the part that builds up the dread, and it builds up the concern and all that stuff. So I thought that was really interesting. I mean, it's not to say I like everything, you know, like, you know, I get why we have to have like Vera Farmiga's character worried about her husband, and he's actually in episode 2 and then leaves again because things don't seem that bad yet. And honestly, like, I don't feel like her being concerned, and because I think episode 2's cliffhanger is her on the phone, like, trying to get to him when she's found out that the flooding is going to get worse and she's worried. And that's kind of your stinger at the end of the episode. And I didn't really feel like that was that meaningful to me. Like, her being worried about her husband, as much as it may help inform some of that character's decisions later, it doesn't feel that connected or relevant yet, and I'm not too fussed about it. So, you know, it's a minor quibble, but it's just one of those things where maybe they put a little bit of relationship drama. And it's not much, it really isn't, but it's just a smidge, I guess, just to try and give her something that's her own, that's just kind of her normal human side, before she's just included in all the decisions being made and what she's going to do as a doctor. But so you've got that. Episode 3, I really liked kind of the logistics stuff, which is, oh, we're going to have to try and evacuate because this water's getting bad and the power's going to be cut. And once the power's cut, if there's a character in episode 3 who even says, once the power's cut, it's not a hospital anymore, it's just a building. I mean, I would debate that there's a lot of doctors and nurses who, even that still kind of makes it very valuable place to be in a crisis, because they can help still to an extent. Admittedly, yes, the patients who require ventilators and anything else, you know, they are screwed with no power. So, but I loved, there's a whole sort of section where it's like, okay, there's a helipad, right? And we might be able to get some helicopters from the Coast Guard or something. Okay, to help evacuate. So, do we have a helipad? And it's like, well, yeah, we do. And it's not been used since the 80s. And we don't even know if it's, like, functional and safe. And part of me was thinking, but isn't the helipad just, maybe slightly elevated, but just like a little square, or not a little bit, you know what I mean? Like, you know, many helipads on rooftops that you see are just a, you know, a big part of concrete on the top of a roof, maybe a little elevated to keep it a little higher than any little small kind of huts or buildings or equipment on the roof. But this thing has got an absurdly high helipad. It's this rickety, like, staircase that has to snake around it, and it's this big, and it's rusted, and it's creaking, and the camera's focusing on, like, the beams starting to, like just sort of, like, you know, not be very happy that even people are on it. And it's like, can this even take the weight of a helicopter? There's too much corrosion. They've not used this in ages. Like, them trying to decide that, and then, like, this helicopter landing because they see someone, and then them having to evacuate one patient, and they decide to evacuate the babies first, and they have to carry the baby in this big clunky, like, you know, safety crib. I don't even know what you call it, but like, you know what I'm talking about, what they have in the hospital. So you've got 4 nurses, like, going up all these stairs, and they're in, like, this obscene heat. and they get to the top, and the guy in the helicopter is just pissed that it took so long. So because the elevators aren't running for the record, so they're even using the stairs inside as well. So they're like, they eventually evacuate, but it's all this kind of like, okay, we've got this countdown until we don't have any power because the backup generators will be flooded. Okay, we've got this countdown to this problem, and ongoing with that, probably the more infuriating side of this is the lack of help that's coming from other places. So you see, like it's like the business management side of the parent company for the hospital, but we see this character talking to a client in episode 1 or 2. I can't remember which one we first see him, but this client that they're talking to asks like, "Oh, this Cucina business, this is something like this is good for business, though, right? Like you make more money in this time." And as he's saying this, they do this really smart thing. This is a really smart directorial choice to edit in like some quick flashes of the tragedy, like of quick flashes of people being like lifted in a helicopter on a stretcher off of a roof surrounded by water and things like that, just to show how disgusting this like very smiley question is being presented. That this guy is like, hey, that must be good for business. You're making a lot of money because there's all this tragedy and people need hospitals and medical care. And later on, the guy, the worker, the character we're following, he reiterates this back to a co-worker, and he's like, well, yeah, I guess technically it is good for business, but that's a pretty shitty question to ask. And it's like, okay, at least they're acknowledging that. But this guy that heard this question, he ends up being quite prominent in episode 3 because he's the one who is getting emailed by the hospital. Well, they've got a few hours of power left at most, right? They know it's going away, and they're phoning around and emailing, asking for help to evacuate because they need to evacuate. There's no question they need to. So he's the one getting the emails at the parent company, and it's sounding obviously urgent. And he asks like people around him, and they're like, I don't know. I mean, someone almost tries to get him to ignore what he's doing because he has to approve like a brochure or something. Like he has to like write off on like this little catalog that someone else has made, and he's like, no, I'm going to like not do it, because he almost does it, and he's like, no, you know what? No, that seems important. I'm going to, and he talks to his superior, and the superior is like, I don't know, we're the business like side of things, we don't deal with this. And this character comes back to the computer, says that it basically just wishes them good luck, but apparently this is the Coast Guard and so on that's supposed to be helping you, so best of luck. And the woman at the hospital types back, wait, you're saying we're on our own, you're not going to help us? And we see him get this response, and we cut to her, and she's relieved when he says, no, I'm here, I will help. And sure enough, throughout the episode, he's like phoning around himself, trying to just like arrange for anyone who can like fly in and take them, you know, and maybe even he's phoning other hospitals to see which hospitals in nearby cities or states can take their patients or whatever. And then later in the episode, his boss comes out and says, look, I've called this in, and their official stance as a company is that this falls under a disaster, a flood. This is not, you know, lifting a patient out of like a crash or something like that. And because of that, this falls under National Guard and the authorities. This is not our thing. We stay out of it. And it's like an official order telling him to leave it and drop it. And this is where like some of my memories of Chernobyl were starting to come in, and I was getting angry at the casual like day at the office when this is their hospital that is full of like 1,000 people, they said, like 200 patients, and then hundreds of staff, and then just lots of civilians and family members who you know sought out shelter during the hurricane. Really kind of infuriating stuff, and this was where it was getting more interesting. I thought episode 3 was the best of the 3 episodes because it was really starting to like kind of claw at some of the really fascinating stuff, as opposed to just the typical, you know, there's a crisis, there's a hurricane, and there's some tensions and stuff like that. And you know, some of the debates start to come in a little bit more by then as well, like debating which patient should go first and who do we prioritize. And on top of that, like the patients who have, you know, signed the no revive clause, like they don't want to be resuscitated, like, can we kind of like just like ignore them for other patients because they've kind of opted out in a weird way. And there's a debate of like, yeah, but that's not what not being revived means. That just means if they actually flatline, that we don't revive them, not this. So these sort of debates are where it gets kind of interesting in the morals of it, and the like the kind of the corruption side of it, of like, and it's not even technically corruption, but just corruption in my eyes of like, why isn't there a plan for this, and why isn't like the parent company like making this their priority? There's one guy who's got a bit of a conscience in the office who is making a few phone calls on his own because he feels bad. No one else seems to give a shit. No one else thinks it's their problem. They're just passing the buck, as it were, off. So that's really fascinating stuff to see. And also they have the first death at the end of episode 3 as well, which kind of shakes them a little bit. And because that's actually one of the other like fascinating things about this, is that there's technically a second hospital inside the building. And by that I mean, so I think it's called Life Care, and it's basically just like it's for more long-term patients who just need care for. So they like, it's a different company effectively, and they like rent out the top floor of the building. And in episode 1, like the person who's running the crisis stuff in the hospital says, well, they'll have their own plan, they'll have their own person in charge up there, and they'll like they come from a company that is bigger or has more money or whatever, so they've probably got better resources than we do. But as we see over the episodes, like they don't have any doctors up there on staff currently, they just have nurses. And when stuff starts happening in the building, they're not even aware of it. They have to come down and ask and say, what's going on? Like, what's happening? Are we evacuating? How's that going to work? Who's helping us? They're getting no help. They're not being able to contact anyone in their parent company either. But it creates this really interesting thing where all of the main people that we're following are actually ignoring this floor, at least up until a point, right? Obviously, there's a certain humanitarian side of this where, towards the end of episode 3, when someone's dying upstairs, like one of the nurses runs down and begs for a doctor, and Vera Farmiga and one of the other guys runs up as quickly as they can. It's ultimately futile, but it's just like, okay, right. So, but even that was kind of interesting from again, like them not even been in the loop on the decisions, them not being counted, like. Because I guess you have to think about that, is that every time like they're talking about numbers, they're only really talking about the memorial hospital. They're not really including that other floor that's full of even more serious long-term patients, which is, like, again, and it's not that they're being evil. It's just like, no, this is like what I'm in charge of. This is what I'm doing. But there's a certain point, of course, where it's like, well, we're just in like we're in like an unforeseen crisis here. We're in like the biggest crisis that many of us are ever going to face. We're going to have to just kind of start thinking a little bit more about the humanity of it, rather than the bureaucracy of who's in charge of where. But obviously, like it does kind of feel like it's building up to eventually people disagreeing with her in charge. Like mostly people are agreeing with her up until now, but it feels like she has to ask, are we agreeing on this? And they're kind of saying yes, but it does kind of feel like one or two of them are hesitating a little bit. So maybe there's going to be some, not power play necessarily, but some disputes over the courses of action. I'd be surprised if there wasn't over the next couple days and episodes. But that stuff's really interesting. Yeah. I thought it was going to be more of a long-term thing, actually, because the big ending thing for episode 1 is that there's actually like a wing of the hospital, just one floor, but it's like across the street, and there's like a connecting sort of bridgeway, like a corridor that goes over the street, and obviously there's a nice big fancy shot of Vera Farmiga walking across it, and you're like, oh dear, this seems like a really bad thing for a hurricane. And sure enough, at the end, all the windows blow out and it starts shaking, and it's like, oh, this is going to go down. And they have to evacuate their little separate area over to the main building, because if they don't, they're going to be on their own for the night, and they don't, presumably they don't have as many supplies or anything like that. So that's kind of your big action set piece for the end of episode 1. I feel like this bridgeway probably definitely existed. I wonder if it's just convenient that this could be their big finale of episode 1, because it's something that happened at the end of night 1, because it ends here. I think if I think there might have been a temptation to do more of the stuff that happened later in that night, because it basically cuts to the next morning, the next episode. And I wonder if like the choice was made not to like show more of like during the night of the storm after that point, because it just made for like a good climax to the episode. Even though the episode did feel a bit short when it ended, but I wonder if that was kind of why that choice was made. I'm not sure, but yeah. So I have fairly positive things to say about these episodes so far. It's not up there with Chernobyl. It's not exceptional, but it is very well directed. It's very slick, in the right ways. It feels like it's bringing in some of that kind of like survival logistical problems that I kind of enjoy exploring. It's dealing with the moral choices as well a bit more as it goes on, which is kind of what I thought was going to be the main appeal of the show, because of the trailer clearly set that up, which is why all the action shots of like destruction kind of felt out of place. It felt like a weird thing to sort of focus so heavily on in the trailer. I get that it is the big shot she spent a lot of money on, and it is part of the show, it is in there, but it did make it look more of a disaster movie, and I don't think that it feels like that necessarily. I mean, it feels a little bit that at times, because inherently that's what it is, a disaster. It is literally a disaster, but it does feel like it's building up to more kind of the choices that were made later on. That gives it a bit more of a bite than any. I mean, remove the fact that most disaster movies are these over-the-top silly disasters that are far-fetched, and this is like a very real disaster. But like even ignoring that, like just the idea that you're building up to kind of these like tough choices that are going to be made later, and they're teasing them throughout with these interview segments at the start. In fact, the end of episode 3 ends with the interview segment, and the word "kill" is used instead of like so it's not just that they could that this doctor they're interviewing couldn't stop death. It was like he couldn't stop them from being killed. That's what the interviewer says. And so if you don't know what the story is of this, it's clearly signposting that roughly where it's going. And of course the opening did as well with all the dead bodies. That there was going to be something more to this than just this is how many people died in the hurricane. There's going to be a bit more to actually tell there. So, yeah, it's pretty damn solid. It's really solid. It's kind of really easy to watch in a weird way. Like obviously it's about real incidents, and it's poking at things and getting to know like the son and the son's wife of this old woman who's in the hospital, who are trying to make their way there. In fact, I should mention that the thing in episode 3 I said that I wasn't sure if this really happened, but it's a nice thought that it did. Is so yeah, one of the old women who's in like the day or the life care part of the hospital, like they know the power's going to go out. They've heard it over the phone while they can still contact them, and the son's like, look, let's drive in and try and help. Let's follow maybe some of the emergency people, and try and get to the hospital so we can take her, because maybe if they can't evacuate, we can at least take his mother out and go. And still feels a little bit like, I don't know if you've seen like the conditions and how bad it's getting. I don't know how much you're going to be able to travel in this either, but they find like a fire station and they volunteer, and they say, well, okay, well, there's like a bunch of firefighters like hanging around, and all the trucks are here, and like you're just all waiting about. Why? Like what's going on here? Why is everyone at the station? And the guy in charge is like, because we've not been given orders yet. Like no one's told us where to go or what to do. So again, some of that frustration comes back in. Like, oh, this is like there's emergency services literally sitting twiddling their thumbs, waiting to just be told where to go. And the nice thing that kind of happens that is kind of a fist pump moment is that eventually they're watching the news, they're seeing how bad things are getting, they hear about an explosion, and eventually the fire chief is just like, you know what, screw this, we're not waiting for orders, gear up, that we're moving. So he's just sort of like going, rogue's not the right word, but they're just going to go in and try and help where they can, and just start doing stuff. So very frustrating that they've not been told to do anything, but that choice to just go in anyway feels like quite a heartfelt moment. And I do wonder like if that really happened. It may have done, I don't know, but it also felt like it could have easily been written for a TV show, because it's like a, you know, it feels like a really cinematic kind of choice moment, you know. But yeah, so that's 5 days at Memorial. I would recommend checking it out, and I would recommend, unless you like hate the first episode, in which case, yeah, fair enough. But if you're, you know, kind of into it but you're not sure yet, I would say watch the first 3 and sort of see if you're intrigued by what it's like hitting at by the 3rd episode. So yeah, it's fairly solid stuff. So yeah, I won't be reviewing anymore because I don't really think I'd have much to say about each episode individually. You know, because I don't necessarily talk about everything that happened in all 3 of these episodes, and it's actually quite hard to remember them all because there's so many characters and there's so many like different patients that I've not mentioned, different doctors. There's a doctor walking around with a gun and there's some tension about that. Like, there's a whole bunch of things going on, and I don't think that I'm going to have much to say on each individual episode, but I think just talking about the first 3 as a whole and sort of giving my impression about how the show feels right now, I would say it's worth checking out if you're interested in the topic, or if you like this type of show. So but yeah, that's 5 days at Memorial. So if you did watch the first 3 episodes on Apple, let me know what you thought of them in the comments below. Like, subscribe, ding the bell for notifications, all that stuff. You can support all the content by hitting the super thanks button below the video, or going over to patreon.com/mailfuzztv and support us over there for, you know, for well, possibly ever if you want. A couple months, forever, whatever strikes your fancy. I didn't know where I was going with that sentence, so it went into a weird place. So yeah, that's good stuff. So that's me, that's the show, that's the review. Thank you very much for joining me. I do appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?